The agenda for this proposal is as follows. I will discuss the purpose of the project, demographic and characteristics of the target population, which is Syrian refugees, the types of trauma in this population, a description of trauma assessment and screening instruments for adaptation, a step-by-step cross-cultural adaptation procedures, any ethical considerations, resources, advocacy, and then finally conclude with my references for the proposal. To begin, advocacy includes efforts that should be mindful of the limited services and resources in marginalized groups and communities, reduction of social inequalities in mental health care and interventions could be addressed through efforts such as tax credits, funding, grants that aim to support prevention and promotion of different interventions at non-governmental and governmental levels. And finally, outreach and education should involve people from the community and cultures to provide essential services and education widespread and geared towards prevention and promotion of mental well-being. The purpose of the project includes discussing the ethical, advocacy, and resource needs for this project, an analysis of the experiences among the Syrian refugee population through a culturally adapted screening and assessment tool, and finally to study post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, distress, and complex trauma among the Syrian refugee population. The types of trauma that often appear among Syrian refugees include, but are not limited to, PTSD, complex PTSD, anxiety, psychological and physical distress that impacts existing psychological disorders and quality of life, and trauma experiences can stem from incidents that include rape, torture, murder, war and conflict, and genocide. Please take a moment and pause and watch the CBS This Morning interview based on this population that provides more context and insights. Description of trauma assessment and screening instrument for adaptation. The ITQ, or the International Trauma Questionnaire, is a self-report measure for CPTSD and PTSD, which corresponds to the diagnostic criteria in the International Classification of Diseases, the 11th version, or the ICD-11. The ITQ is a self-report measure, and it corresponds with the criteria. The 18-item short form asks for patient feedback and symptom change during therapy and treatment decisions based on a person's standing and clinical cutoff points. Narrative descriptions of PTSD and CPTSD could effectively be operationalized for research and clinical purposes through use of the ITQ. Step-by-step cross-cultural adaptation procedures. Step 1 involves information gathering. Collecting information on the socioeconomic aspects of a target population, the available need for support and mental health intervention, and obstacles to accessing care. This will lead into Step 2, the adaptation phase. Establishing clear explanations of major concepts within a population, awareness of local dynamics and issues, which can include domestic abuse, stigma, and lastly, identifying cultural and ethical appropriate supports and social supports. Step 3 will involve local consultation. This means adapting any instrument or intervention based on protocols in this unique population or target population, the psychological distress in the group, and any local supports and resources in terms of translation and language should be considered. Lastly, Step 4 is the external evaluation. This supports the adaptation of the instrument, meaning it will be made including data analysis, drafting, and review of the findings. And the final review is the effectiveness of the overall cross-cultural adaptation process. Ethical considerations. Scientific and professional obligations to society include respect for the dignity of people and persons, fairness, and justice in the treatment of persons and groups. Syria is a collectivistic society and culture, and trauma is thought of in a cultural perspective, which is felt deeply within the interconnected web of individuals, groups, and families who may feel this trauma and damage due to local and group circumstance. Mutual respect and just treatment of individuals and groups should be primary concerns. It can be beneficial to connect with local ethical standard board or organization within the country of research to gather more information and seek additional consultation about what is acceptable ethically and legally within the country. If such a board or regulating body does not exist, it can be important to be familiar with the standards in the researcher's home country. Lastly, psychologists and researchers are responsible to maintain honest, accurate, and open communication and culturally informed confidentiality and disclosure throughout the research process. In terms of resources and budget, the personnel for this proposed grant project, there are no funds requested for the researcher's salary, and funds will be requested to be determined based on individual stipend for each student assistant researcher as needed. Travel funding will be requested so researchers can travel to Syria and meet and collaborate with a representative from communities, NGOs, and local agencies and organizations. The lead researcher will pay for room and board expenditures. The total in-country travel funds is to be determined. Data entry and report publication. Trained members of the research team will perform the data entry. Once it is reviewed by the team, the final report will periodically require funds for publishing. Support staff and consultation. The total funds requested for support staff and consultation is to be determined. This funding will be allocated as administrative and operational tasks as they arise. Workshops and meetings. The fundings for workshops and meetings will ideally include technology costs to hold virtual meetings and all additional costs regarding technology. The funds requested for meetings will be determined based on funding allocation. Lastly, miscellaneous or unexpected costs. The funding requested for miscellaneous expenses is to be determined and will not necessarily be included in the final funding request. This funding is for any unplanned or additional costs during the research process. These funds will be dedicated to emergency expenses. On the following slide, the resources are continued that are current on-the-ground resources in Syria, working firsthand with refugees and people experiencing or in need of psychological and mental health resources and interventions. This concludes my grant proposal for the assessment and cultural adaptation proposal. Thank you so much for listening. On this slide, you will find my references that were referenced throughout this presentation. Thank you.